conservative religious tradition, probably the 1835 Lectures on Revivals of Religion by Charles Grandison Finney. CF suggested, mildly, that I should try broadening my reading interests. He thought maybe I could read Martin Buber and Paul Tillich and maybe the economist John Kenneth Galbraith. And then finally, towards the end of our talk, he gently suggested I would profit quite a bit if I transferred to the top track. So I agreed. And that was the beginning of a relationship that lasted for many years. The most dramatic bit was when I agreed to finish roofing his house during the summer of my junior year in college and fell off the roof. This accounts for the fact that my right arm still has limitations in motion and, incidentally, the reason I was classified 4F when I was called up for the draft. I tell this apocryphal story that as I was falling, I thought about how a cat falls in order to avoid too much impact. And also, well, I knew I wouldn't die, but I would get out of the draft. This is 1971, so it was an imminent possibility that I would be drafted. Now, as it happens, the political tendency that Goldwater ran on, generally referred to as movement conservative, became the dominant ideology of the Republican Party with Reagan's ascension to the presidency. And we've come to a time in our national history where our political parties have almost no ideological overlap. The percentage of Democrats who would classify themselves as conservative is very low, as is the percentage of Republicans who would identify themselves as liberal. So a chasm has opened between our parties and only gotten worse since the workshop I mentioned in 2014, a lot worse. Unfortunately, the dialogue among those of different political persuasions has more frequently turned towards diatribe, and especially in the last 8 years or so. And we Unitarian Universalists identify ourselves as a member of a liberal religion. Our religious commitments are, in particular, liberal in that we are creedless. We don't insist that everyone believe alike in matters of religious doctrine, and we welcome everyone regardless of belief. Or at least that's what we say, though in truth, Christians sometimes feel less welcome than Buddhists in our congregations. So it's an easy extension of our religious liberalism to the assumption that we are also politically liberal. When we get into political questions, and by the way, our faith calls us to be active in the public square, many, if not most of us, would identify as progressive or in the Democratic Party. And if someone were to express a deep concern about the deficits that were incurred to help pull us out of the Great Recession, as does Paul Roche, or to raise question about too ready access to abortion, or heaven forfend equal marriage, the instant response most of us would offer would be, but we're liberals. And that's a problem. As Paul Roche put it in our reading this morning, it's my proposition that to be truly the church for the 21st century, we will need to welcome all those who share the love for our faith and its 7 principles, our dreams, our aspirations, but may believe there's a different political path to get there. We are liberal in religion, but that doesn't in fact entail that all of us are or should be liberal in politics. In many of our congregations, people who are drawn to our tolerance of a diversity of religious belief fairly quickly discover that our tolerance of political diversity is less apparent. I'm concerned about the degree to which our political differences are driving us apart as a nation. And I'm not blind to the reality that the take-no-prisoners tactics of Republicans in Congress, starting as far back as the Clinton administration some 30 years ago, have been mostly responsible for the paralysis of our government's ability to respond to national and international issues of great urgency, all exacerbated by the polarizing action of this current administration, which are intended to turn Americans against each other. But there's a real risk to national solidarity when we find ourselves driven apart to such a degree that we can't even understand how people on the other side could possibly believe what they do. And when we find ourselves shouting denunciations across a grand canyon of incomprehension over the stupidity of those people. So I went back to listen more closely to the politics I committed myself to in the 8th grade before I came to believe that Goldwater was a risky bet for the country and that he would, for example, drag us more deeply into the war in Vietnam. Oh, wait, that happened anyway, didn't it? It seemed to me that it would be useful to try to get a better sense of what movement conservatism really was and is. If I was to have any hope of understanding the political beliefs of relatives and neighbors without automatically retreating into saying, but we're liberals. So I went back to read a biography of William F. Buckley and got a better notion of how his politics were critically shaped by the experiences of his father, a wealthy oil man and entrepreneur in Mexico during the 1910 revolution there. I reread the economics chapter of God and Man at Yale. I started reading Barry Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative. I read Ted Cruz's campaign biography, and I came to understand that there are differences of not just opinion, but of ways of thinking about the way that we exist as political creatures. In fact, the roots of the conservative movement can be traced much farther back to the arguments between Thomas Paine on the one side and Edmund Burke about the French Revolution. I had to rethink whether the French Revolution was, in fact, a heroic blow for human freedom against the tyranny and backwardness of feudalism, or a much more complex social upheaval that, in fact, descended into terror, became deeply destructive, and led the way to Napoleon, founder of a new despotism, fueled by his endless wars of conquest. Don't worry, I haven't given up any of my personal political convictions. I haven't reverted to the beliefs that I had in 8th grade, but I've gotten a better appreciation of the complexity of the disagreements between conservatives and liberals in our era. I've come to realize that we've become divided in part by litmus tests that we set for each other in religion and politics and personal choices. We've come to have sides that are so clearly defined that we're all tempted to judge one another across the whole range of opinions that define which side we're on. And we've all been pushed into all or nothing corners from which we hurl invective across chasms of misunderstanding, in which any deviation from wholehearted devotion to our side on every litmus test is denounced as treason. Tell me how you feel about gun control, and I can predict your beliefs about immigration, gay rights, foreign aid, and a whole host of other issues. And I have come to realize that when we don't pay attention to other political viewpoints, our own commitments are shallower than they could be. I think Paul Roche is right when he says, think of the integrity we would foster by engaging all of our UU brain power in deeper discussions about the issues rather than jumping to partisan conclusions. To help counter a kind of knee-jerk response of, but we're liberals, to anything conservatives and reactionaries have to say, I just want to begin to sketch what I hope is a more nuanced description of some of the foundations of our most critical political differences between conservatives and liberals. First, there's a major disagreement about the fundamental nature of human beings, what we might refer to as our respective anthropologies. Our religious traditions rejected the doctrine of original sin over 2 centuries ago. I use these words in child dedication ceremonies, for example. Child dedication in our Unitarian Universalist congregations is not the same as baptism or christening, which symbolize a cleansing of original sin. We believe that children are born innocent and that at the heart of that innocence lies the capacity for both good and ill. Any parent who believes that their child will remain an innocent and will display only signs of goodwill will be disabused of that notion by about the age of 2. If not well before that. The terrible 2s do come to almost all of our kids. And those of us who tried more hands-off modes of discipline often found ourselves with serious behavioral issues to deal with later on. The thing is that we human beings are frail. We're all imperfect. We cannot, in fact, become everything we want to be. There are various stories to explain how we humans came to be this way. There's the story of the Garden of Eden, which sketches an image of perfection, ease to be found in the garden, followed by a fall into the difficulties of living in the real world. And there's another story from Greek mythology, the story of Pandora's box, which tells us how human beings were comfortable, not oppressed by great evils, when Pandora opened the box and let free all the horrors that sometimes beset our human lives, but also hope, which can help us through some of the toughest times of our lives. Sometimes religious liberals can seem naive in not accepting that there's both good and evil in each of us. We forget Alexander Solzhenitsyn's observation that, quote, "The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." We have to bear in mind that we're not perfect. And that's one of the points that conservatives make. People need boundaries, rules, clear directions, and consequences for bad behavior. A little humility is sometimes in order. So there follows a second significant difference, this one about social order, which is one way of giving boundaries to human beings. Conservatives hold that some things are simply sacred in themselves. Conservatives in general, for example, see the Constitution as a virtually sacred document that must be understood exactly as the founders intended it. Many of us who went through the struggle over the Vietnam War lost respect for the flag, which was touted especially by supporters of the war and continues to be. And that's a problem because, in fact, the flag is simply a symbol of our United States. And when we allow it to be taken over as an exclusively conservative symbol, it means that liberals can seem to be less patriotic. And fealty to the Constitution as it has evolved is an important bulwark against the tyranny of leaders who proclaim their devotion to it while blithely violating it. Conservatives tend to regard liberals as being utopians who believe it's possible to create a perfect society. But there are risks in creating a perfect society. For example, communism was an attempt to reshape society from the ground up in order to replace it with an ideal world. Cuba's revolution was committed to training its youth to become socialist men and women, free from the temptations of selfishness and greed that Fidel argued were caused by capitalism. One of the consequences of that experiment was that those who could not or would not conform themselves to the new order had to be shunned, imprisoned, or eliminated. Life is complicated. Issues we face as citizens are complicated. We all find ourselves guided by our own experience and beliefs toward ideas about how to best think about the issues our nation faces. The problem with having a litmus test, which determines if our own views and feelings align with those of our friends and neighbors, is that we're driven to all or nothing positions without any subtleties. The particular issues that arise from our own personal uniqueness are set aside in order to be able to fit in on our side of a great political divide. When thinking about immigration, we might be drawn to welcoming the stranger under any and all circumstances, but we might also be aware that too high a level of immigration can destabilize a country. Voters in Massachusetts will again be faced with a proposition to approve dignity in dying, and we might feel drawn to supporting it without question because no one should have to suffer unnecessarily. But what if a change like that makes many people choose to end their lives because they feel useless or just lonely? Every time there's a mass shooting, there's a surge of support for banning all guns, but might there be circumstances in which a gun might be useful, as was the case for a good friend of ours living on a mountain in Georgia where rattlesnakes showed up on occasion? When we set up issues as us versus them, as all or none, these subtleties are lost on us. Several characteristics of this moment in history are driving this polarization, including loneliness. In 2023, the Surgeon General issued a report, Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, which found that approximately 50% of adults in the country are feeling lonely, and that people of all ages are spending significantly less time with others. That's why our congregations are so important, because they provide us a social context that keeps us from being alone, that assures us we have others who care for us. And then in our loneliness, many of us turn to social media or national news. But those resources are themselves obviously polarized. Like the rest of the public space, our sources of information have come to be their own litmus test. Do you watch MSNBC or Fox? All of these features are dragging us apart and tempting us to see people on the other side as unlike us, lacking our intelligence, our education, compassion, or even common sense. But in this way, we're dragged apart rather than being brought together. In fact, the nationalization of our civic discourse drags us away from our neighbors, our own immediate community, and toward issues over which, in fact, we have virtually no control. We forget the neighbor we should be trying to love in order to be part of a much larger but abstract group of those who think like us. We need to focus on loving and attending to the people who are near us. I don't mean we should not have any opinions about what happens in the rest of the world, and I'm in no way endorsing the actions of our current government. We should understand, though, that part of the idea of the actions of this administration include flooding the zone, which is to say doing outrageous things on a regular basis to make everybody pay attention all the time. And when we are in a state where we're constantly saying, oh my God, what if they, our entire attention becomes focused there instead of here. I don't mean we shouldn't have any opinions. I don't mean that it doesn't matter to have opinions. The problem is that when we have strong opinions that are everything that's happening everywhere, we don't have much time to pay attention to what's happening here and now. We're distracted by knowing a lot about things, but not enough about what really matters to ourselves, our families, our communities. And in fact, the loss of community and the sorting of individuals into different communities as individuals is making it much harder for us to understand other people and therefore to live out the core of our Unitarian Universalist faith with love at the center. And of course, life is not all about politics. Paul Roche says this in another part of his presentation. A hungry family does not care that the person volunteering at the food pantry may have voted for John McCain. In the Washington, D.C. area, we're blessed to be in a huge melting pot of the world's peoples and faith. And when we break bread at interfaith events, no one asks for whom the guy who made the macaroni and cheese, me, voted. I don't care whether the lady who made the chicken korma voted at all. We're there to eat and sing and dance and get to know one another, breaking down barriers. Think about what we could accomplish in the way of human rights and real social justice if we grew substantially in numbers. We could then become a transformative force for our nation and the world instead of being lumped in as other liberal religions in the pew polls. I hope that this meeting house congregation can be welcoming to a diversity of political opinions alongside your welcoming of a diversity of religious beliefs and people of every race, ethnicity, class, and gender orientation. I hope we can be welcoming across partisan divides and that by listening closely we can find common ground and help to bridge some of the yawning chasm that threatens to tear our nation apart. We would do well in our political moments to remember the words of Abraham Lincoln in his first inaugural address. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. the mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. The congregational affirmation that we shared this morning, also shared with many other UU congregations, of course, affirms that love is the spirit of this meeting house, and that we commit ourselves to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Seeking the truth in love means listening first, listening deeply, and then formulating our own beliefs and opinions in dialogue with those with whom we disagree. May we learn to listen deeply, to understand with compassion, and to dwell together in peace. Lord, give us peace. May it be so.